Imagine you are out having a drink with a friend, and your friend starts to talk about politics. Now, maybe you're red and they're blue, maybe you're blue and they're red. Who knows? The point is that they have, even though you guys are friends, even though you guys are close, they have a very different perspective on some key issues than you do. Now, you're getting into it, they're friends, but no matter what you say, you realize you are never, ever going to convince them of anything. And they are never going to convince you of their perspective, because the more they say, the more you dig in your heels. The more that you say, the more you realize, what is up with this person? Why are they becoming so defensive? And this is a common challenge when we are trying to influence or persuade others. We often think that if we can just create the right argument, if we can just create the right rationale, if we can just back ourselves with enough facts and figures, we can convince them that we are right and they are wrong. But here's the thing. Spending time and energy trying to convince people of anything does not work. If we reinforce their beliefs, they will agree with us. If we try to convince them of something different than what they believe, they will most likely get their back up against a wall and start to argue with us. And so this is true with your friend over a drink in politics. This is true with your family over Thanksgiving dinner. And this is true all day, every day in our companies, in our businesses, in our sales processes, in our marketing, in our advertising. We have to stop trying to convince people of things, because there is a better way. There's a better way that has been proven time and time again. Stop convincing and start leveraging the hidden, invisible influence strategies that are out there. And that's what we're going to dive into with today's guest, Jonah Berger. Now, Jonah's a marketing professor at the Wharton School of Business, and he's a top expert in behavioral science. He's written bestseller books like Contagious, Invisible Influence, The Catalyst, and Magic Words, books that I have devoured and I have absolutely loved. Now, Jonah's research has been widely recognized, and he's worked with massive companies like Apple and Google and Nike. And today, he's on the podcast to share how to use hidden strategies to influence and drive action so you can change people's minds. So welcome to How to Sell More, the sales podcast for non-salespeople, where each week we give a masterclass to help ambitious B2B leaders just like you tackle the biggest challenge, the number one struggle that we all have to work on all day, every day, and that is growing revenue. I'm Mark Drager. Let's get into it. Jonah, what I'm so excited to talk to you about is this idea of influence, because I think so much of your work boils down to either understanding that there are powers at play in the world, in media, in social media. And it seems like you've dedicated your career to understanding why things take off, why things spread, why they become viral. And in doing so, you almost have to study how we are influenced. So before we dig into all of the tactics of persuasion and everything else, can you just help me and all of our viewers understand why, as people, we're so easily influenced?
Yeah, I think particularly in a sort of North American culture, more generally, influence can almost be seen as a bad word, right? Like, oh, I was influenced. Why are you influenced? People hate seeing themselves as influenced. They don't want to be influenced. But what's so interesting is, being influenced in general, broadly speaking, is quite useful, right? So imagine, every time you wanted to buy a product, every time you wanted to pick a restaurant, every time you wanted to go on vacation, you had to do all the work yourself to figure it out, right? Even take something as simple as where to go for lunch, right? You'd have to look at all the menus yourself. You'd have to get and sample them, right? So how would you know if a place would be any good? And so life would be not only a lot more time consuming, but also just a lot more difficult. And so influence can be very useful. It can be very adaptive, right? Influence can help us make better decisions by relying on others' experiences. Sometimes often in a commercial, a product will look great, but it's not actually that great. And so relying on our friends and peers helps us make better decisions, not just what the company wants us to think, but what people actually say. You go to a restaurant's website, it looks amazing. But if you look at the reviews, they'll say, well, it looks amazing, but the food isn't as good as they promise. Well, now that influence really helped me make a better decision. Or even if it doesn't help me make a better decision, it can help me make a faster decision, right? It can help me make a good decision faster. In many cases, ordering things online, for example, almost all the options are pretty good, right? It's not like, many of them are going to be terrible. And so you can't really go wrong, but seeing what others have liked the most will help you find something quickly that's quite good. And so whether it's saving us time, effort, energy, or just making our lives better, influence is often quite useful, right? Think even as our sort of, our early prehistoric forebears. Imagine if you couldn't be influenced. You had to figure out where to hunt for food just because you knew that information yourself. Life would be really hard. And so relying on others helps us sort of forage for information more quickly and makes us better off. And so, yes, in today's world, seeing ourselves as influence can be perceived negatively, but it often makes us better off.
It's funny because when I asked that question, I asked it knowing I was like, oh, I can't wait to talk about how terrible influences on us and how it's making us do the things we don't want to do and not even giving us all the options for the decisions we make. And yet you've completely flipped it on me because you reminded me of, I got laser eye surgery a bunch of years ago. And at the time, one of my employees, who is one of the most analytical people in the world, I knew he had laser eye surgery. And so I said, okay, where did you get this LASIK done? And he listed a local clinic. I said, okay. And then I asked someone else, hey, where did you get it done? They said the same clinic. And I didn't look anything else up then. I didn't spend any more time on it. I didn't look it up. I went for the consultation. They were like, they were like concerned with the price. I said, I don't really care what it costs. They were saying, well, which package? I said, just whatever this person said. Do you have any questions? I have no questions. Just because I trust these two people.
Yes. And
I realized I don't need to go down the same rabbit hole they went down.
Yes. Yeah. And I love a few things about that, right? So first of all, it just made your decision much easier. And sure, you could have looked at brochures, but the brochures probably would have said the same things. We have great service. We care. No company says they don't care about their customers. But so saying you care about your customers isn't very diagnostic. But if two people went and they had a great experience, you're probably going to have a great experience as well. And that also speaks to something I talk about in the Catalyst, which is this idea of corroborating evidence. Right. Sometimes, if we're trying to make a small decision or change somebody's mind about something that's pretty simple, we're basically trying to move a pebble, right? You don't need a lot of evidence to move a pebble, but to move a boulder, to move a big decision, laser eye surgery, right? If one person said it was good, you probably say, well, that isn't enough. But if multiple people say the same thing, you're pretty sure you're going to have the same experience.
I'm pretty sure I'm not going to come out blinded, which was my concern here, right? Like, I don't want to be blinded in the surgery.
And there's an old adage that goes something along the lines of, if one person says you have a tail, you laugh at them. Why? Because you don't have a tail. But if 5 people say you have a tail in short succession, well, then you might, turn around to take a look. Because if 5 people who are different people say the same thing, it's much harder to believe that they're wrong. And so influence can be really helpful from the mundane decisions of our daily lives to the really important ones.
Now, everyone listening and watching we're achievers. So as leaders, we're often having to influence others to come along with us, and this is going to be great, and here's the promised land. Or we're trying to convince in a sales opportunity, we're trying to convince someone to buy from us. And so we spend so much time convincing, and yet, I don't know, if as soon as someone tries to convince me of something, not only do I get my back up against a wall instantly, I get so cold and rude that my wife knows in my tone. I tell people I love, do not ever try to sell me on anything. I love you. And so I want to believe what you believe. So please don't hurt yourself by trying to sell me.
Yeah.
What is it about convincing people that just doesn't work?
Yeah. So it's interesting. What you're talking about is this psychological principle called reactance. And the basic idea is when pushed, people push back, right? When people try to convince them of something.
You should see me and my wife have a conversation.
Yeah. And I often, when I talk about the Catalyst, I often put up this figure of sort of a person and sort of forces that we might be pushing on them to push them in a certain direction. And for objects, that works really well, right? If there's a chair and we want to move that chair, pushing the chair is a great way to get a slide across the floor. The problem is when we push people, right? They don't just sit there, they push back. They think about all the reasons they don't want to do what we've suggested. They dig in their heels. They become less likely to do what we wanted, not more. And part of it is this idea of reactance, right? People have an ingrained anti-persuasion radar. They want to feel like they are in charge of their lives. Why did I make a certain choice? buy a certain product, do a certain thing. I did it because I thought it was a good idea. But as soon as whether we are a salesperson, whether we are a marketer, whether we are a boss, whether we are a colleague, whether we are a spouse, whoever we are, as soon as we come in and try to tell someone to do, now they're no longer clear, okay, am I doing this because I thought it was a good idea, because I like it, or because you told me to do it? And the more I feel like I'm doing it because you told me to do it, the less interested I am in doing it. And so rather than pushing people, we've got to figure out how to remove the barriers to change, right? I think a good analogy is, think about being parked in your car. So maybe you're coming out of your kid's soccer game, or you're coming out of a movie, your car's on a hill. You get in the car, you stick your key in the ignition, you step the foot on the gas. If the car doesn't go, we often think, oh, I just need more gas, right? If I just push on the gas more, the car will move. Same with people. If I just push them a little harder, they'll change. But if the parking brake is up in that car, it doesn't matter how much you step on the gas, it's not going to go anywhere. And so the same is true with people, right? We need, rather than stepping on the gas so much, we need to figure out what those parking brakes are, what those barriers or obstacles are in the way of change, and figure out how to mitigate them.
And are there simple ways that we can help figure that out? Because often, we don't have time to plan. I mean, it's nice if you have time to plan out a pitch deck, or if you have time to perhaps like rehearse in your head how the conversation can go, which is something that I do quite often. But how can we prepare how can we render this out in real time when we find ourselves being hit with all of these different objections? And frankly, we just need people to do what we say. Just do it. Like, I'm trying to help you here. Why are you making me work so hard to help you sometimes?
Yeah, but some require very little preparation, right? So I often talk about a strategy I called ask, don't tell. And the idea is something like this. When we tell people something, they push back. When we ask them questions, they do something a little bit different. So a few years ago, I was talking to a startup founder. She was having trouble motivating her team. She was saying, you got to work late, you got to work on weekends, and they didn't want to do it. And I often talk to audience where they say, but I'm the boss, right? I can get people to do what I want. And I think what's tough, even when you're the boss, is you can tell people to do what you want them to do. And in some cases on the surface, they'll even do what you want them to do. But if they're not really believing in what you've asked them to do, they're not going to do their best, right? Like, you tell them, oh, you have to be available at all hours of the day. And so they'll send out an email at 2 a.m. at night, but they're not actually available, right? They've just sent an email to make it seem like they're working at 2 a.m. And so when we push people too much, they figure out ways around what we wanted them to do. And so rather than pushing people so much, she called a meeting and she said, okay, what do we want to be? Do we want to be a good team, a good company, or a great company? And they said, of course, a great company. But then she asked a real question. She says, okay, how do we get there? How do we become a great company? And she starts having a conversation, right? And people say this and they say that, and eventually they get to solution, because questions do three things, right? First, they deactivate that anti-persuasion rate. Rather than telling people what to do when they push back, you've asked them a question. People are more than happy to give you their opinion. There are a few things they like doing more than giving you their opinions. And so you've deactivated that anti-persuasion radar. But second, you've allowed yourself to collect information. Right? Too often as change agents, we know a lot about the outcome we want to achieve, a lot less about the people or organizations we're trying to change. Questions allow us to collect that information. They allow us to figure out what are the objections, what are the problems, what are the barriers, what are the roadblocks, and allow us to reach a better solution. But then third, questions encourage commitment to the conclusion. Because if someone says, okay, great boss, to become a great company, I think we should do this. And then the boss says, fantastic, we're going to do that. It's a lot harder for that person not to go along because it was their idea in the first place, right? I was presenting these ideas about 6 months ago, and somebody goes, it's so funny. My boss loves feeling like things are their idea. And I said, the only funny thing here is it's not just your boss, right? Everyone likes feeling like something is their idea, because if you feel like it's your idea, you're bought into it. You want to see it succeed. And so often we kind of need to give away ownership, right? Because the more we can make people feel like something isn't ours, but it's theirs, the more they want to see it succeed, right? The more they've been a part of the process that reached a conclusion, the more they feel like they participated. And so they're bought into the outcome. And so rather than telling people what to do, asking questions can be a great way to help them get to and us get to a better outcome. And I think that's what's really powerful about some of the ideas in the Catalyst to me. It's not, when I say don't push, identify the barriers. I don't mean just sit there and magically hope something happens. It's use questions, use strategies to lead people down a path without them feeling like that's where they're going. And so that can be a really powerful way to help them make that decision themselves.
Now, one question I do have is when you are putting these books together, when you are doing this work, you can find a study for anything. I mean, we can find a study that supports, hey, if, being around people motivates people to this outcome, but other times being solo motivates people to being outcome.
Yeah.
If you're looking at basketball, being down a few points at halftime means that you're more likely to come back and win. And yet if you're in another sport, like tennis, where it's more of this weird game of one-on-one, you're less likely to win. So I find them all super curious and super interesting, but knowing that the fact that you're like a professor of this, how do you figure out in your head how to bucket these different sides of everything when there are so many studies that prove everything?
Yeah. So people and life, and I don't have to tell you this or your audience this, you guys know it already, are complicated, right? It's not like there's one rule and people always behave according to that rule. There are multiple rules that happen in different situations that shape our behavior. I think the problem, though, is if you start by saying, hey, things are really complicated, in this situation, this happens, in this situation, this happens, in other situations, people just give up their hand, throw their hands up and go, it depends. I don't know. I give up. And so I try really hard in my books to walk a fine line between oversimplifying things in a way that means that even if people applied the rules, they wouldn't actually see the benefit of them. And also being like, it's so complicated. So I often think about it a little bit like an onion, right? Let's talk about a principle, social facilitation. People tend to work harder when others are around them. Okay, that's true. People tend to work harder when others are around them. Let's give some examples of that. Let's talk about it. Then you say, but, right, that working harder can lead to better or worse outcomes, right? Working harder can lead to good outcomes if it's something you're already good at. But working harder can actually make you anxious if it's something you're not good at, and you'll do worse at it, right? For example, other people around makes you really good at tying your own shoes, but often makes you worse at parallel parking, right? Tying your own shoes is something you know how to do really well. You could do it in your sleep. Another person around, no problem. I'll do it well, right? Parallel park is already a little bit difficult. Someone else around adds a little anxiety, makes it harder. And so I try to start with sort of what we describe as a main effect. This is generally true. And then add the nuance, because my hope is that people don't walk away going, well, it depends. I don't know. I give up. But going, I don't just think it depends. I know what it depends on. And if I know what it depends on, I can try to say, is this type of situation or this type of situation? And then I know what to do in each. But life is complicated. I wish it were simpler, but hopefully understanding human behavior will help us improve our batting average in whatever we're doing, right? Whether we're trying to persuade others, whether we're trying to form deeper relationships, whether we're trying to live happier and healthier lives, the more we understand about human behavior, the better off we'll be. I often ask myself, is it better for people to remember, is it better for what you said to be 90% right, maybe 10% wrong? Or is it better for people to remember nothing about what you said? And I think that is a deeply philosophical and moral question that different people may have different sort of answers to. But I often feel like, look, if I tell people something and they don't remember any of it, it could be amazingly right, but it's not going to matter. And so I don't want to be wrong, and I'm never trying to be wrong. And, if you look at the books I write, there are often many footnotes or endnotes saying, yes, but, this is generally true, but this, or this is usually the case, but check these things out. There are a lot of references in my books to academic research. And my goal is not for people to believe that I am right. My goal is to direct them to the great research that's out there if they want to learn more. But at the same time, if I said, hey, here's all the information out there, people probably wouldn't take home any of that information. And so we need, as folks that care about our craft, we need to think about, look, what is my goal, right? When I want someone to learn something in the classroom, for example, and I have an hour to teach them stuff, I've got to make some choices. And you could say, well, you only want to teach them things that's right. That's fair. But you could also say, well, hold on. What about all the things you didn't teach them, right? You are making choices all the time. And so, yes, you want to teach them things that are right, but you also want to put it across in a way that will be more memorable. And so, take something like hedges, for example. So we do this all the time. We say things like maybe and possibly and could and might and it seems to me. And we do all that as almost a subtle tick, right? I do it all the time. I'm terrible at this.
I'm the mayor of Hedge City, let me tell you.
Yes. Yeah. And I'm not saying hedges are bad, but hedges reduce
Oh, you just hedged.
Yes.
No, hedges are bad. That's what we're saying.
Well, so let me get there. Hedges reduce persuasion. We've done a bunch of empirical research showing if you hedge when you say something, people are less persuaded by what you said. They're less likely to take your suggestions, take your advice, follow your action because you seem less certain, because you seem less confident about what you're talking about. And so one thing is to say, well, okay, never hedge. That's right, kind of, right? I'm not saying never hedge. I'm saying if your goal is to communicate uncertainty, that's fine, but recognize that people are going to be less persuaded as a result. Maybe what you want to do is be very certain about a smaller set of things rather than uncertain about a larger set of things, right? Maybe you want to be clear about what you're certain about and clear what you're not certain about. So express a great deal of certainty, but separate the uncertainties and the certainties. And so I agree, you got to understand what your goal is. But I think if we do things by mistake that don't help us, we probably should be aware of those things.
Oh, I visualize in my head these little unlocks, when if you've ever played an RPG or something and you're like, yes, I just leveled up my armor and some little thing happened. You just gave me an unlock because I do struggle at simplifying, not for others. I can see it's super clear in others, but for myself, just keeping the scope of the conversation or the scope of what we're doing super, super narrow. And within that narrow scope, I definitely know what I'm talking about. But I allow myself to go too broad, to go too big into all the areas that I might have an opinion on, but I'm not really sure about.
Yeah.
And I don't know why I do that, actually. Maybe I think if I just talk about this one thing or do this one thing, it's too limiting, it's too small. Maybe there's ego there. Maybe it feels like I'm going to get bored or run out of things to do. I mean, I don't know, but that's an unlock. So thank you.
Yeah. And, I think it does also depend on what our goals are, right? And it depends on what situations that we're in. And so I'm not saying, never hedge. But there's this old Albert Einstein quote, and I'm gonna get it wrong, but it goes something along the lines of, if you can't explain something simply, you don't understand it well enough. And that doesn't mean you're explaining everything. But I think if you truly understand something, you can figure out a simple way to talk about it. Even if it's, look, this is right in this situation, and this other thing is right in this other situation. Rather than saying, this happens sometimes, being clear about when it happens, not just it depends, but what does it depend on? I think great teachers do a good job of that. I think one thing I've found interesting about writing this book, but one challenge I've also found in writing this book is there are a lot of books out there on language. Right? I share a study that we recently did 2 or 3 years ago in this book where I talk about the power of concrete language. And I do that from a study we did analyzing a couple thousand interactions with customer service representatives. So you call a customer service representative on the phone or you email back and forth with them. We look at the language that increases customer satisfaction and purchase and why. And it's basically certain language shows people that you're listening. Now, that truth has been there forever. We didn't invent the truth that concrete language makes people feel that you're listening. But what's possible now is, well, wait, now these phone calls are recorded. We can transcribe them pretty quickly, and we can run automated text analysis through all these conversations to pull out statistical relationships that may have been there forever, but we couldn't see previously. And so there's been a huge wave of increase in measuring language, capturing language, right? You and I are having a conversation right now using voice, but it may be transcribed after this conversation. Similarly, people leave their opinions and attitudes on social media all the time. We can scrape that data and gain insight into how customers feel. And so everything from, the emails that we use, the conversations that we have, we can parse it for insight. And there are better tools to do that. And so is language new? No. Are the findings new? They've always been there. But we now can uncover them in some new and powerful ways.
And being as close to this as you are, is there anything that you see that's worrying or scaring you? Because as you're describing this, I'm thinking, okay, you're gonna do this research. You're gonna put it in the hands of marketers like us. They say marketers ruin everything. We do. And we're gonna use it to manipulate people. We're gonna use it to influence people. It's gonna be short-lived.
Yeah.
People will become aware of it. And then. Is there like this cat and mouse game? Is this pendulum swinging? Are there things where you're like, Oh, Mark, don't even worry about that. AI is going to destroy us all anyway. Like being as close to it as you are, what is it? Are you afraid of anything?
I'll say a few things there. First of all, tools are tools, right? A hammer can be used to build a house. A hammer can be used to hurt somebody. The tool by itself is neither good nor bad. It's neutral. It's just a tool. It's how you use that tool that is either positive or negative. And I think about the same thing about research. If this work that I put out, if this new book is used to help people eat healthier and have better relationships and, those type of things, great. If it's used for marketers to help people get to do things that are good and beneficial, be better to the environment, help them waste less, help them find things that make them happier, all of that is wonderful. If, on the other hand, people use these tools for something bad, well, I'd prefer they didn't. But they're tools, and so my goal is to help people understand themselves and others and put these tools in people's hands and hope and trust that they will use these tools the right way. And so, as a both a tool builder and a tool finder, you can't decide how people use the tools, but I leave that to others to decide how to use them.
That was Jonah Berger. I absolutely loved that conversation. I've been a big fan for a very long time. I've read all of his books, and so it was amazing to be able to connect with him one-on-one. Now, to wrap up this episode, I'm going to share my 3 biggest takeaways from this talk. Number 1, influence can play a positive role in decision-making. Often we think of influence as inherently negative. We think of people trying to manipulate us in negative ways, but it can actually help streamline and enhance the decision-making process by leveraging the experiences or the reviews or the thoughts of others. It will help us make quick choices and better choices with less work. And so once we are aware of that, the question becomes, how do we use that for our advantage in sales and marketing? Number 2, we have to leverage subtle persuasion techniques to help overcome resistance. So we don't fall into the trap of convincing people, but instead we influence them. And so traditional, direct persuasion or convincing often triggers resistance and reluctance and defense mechanisms within the people we're trying to influence. But effective persuasion involves understanding and removing these barriers, removing the friction, removing the uncertainty to change rather than come head on with people's perspectives. And often asking questions rather than giving orders will help reprogram people's thinking and lead them to the result we want. And number 3, there is a massive power in corroborating evidence in influencing decisions. What does that mean? At the end of the day, if people are making significant decisions, they are more likely to be persuaded if they hear the same decision, the same story, the same outcome, the same result from multiple sources time and time again. It adds, each little tick adds in credibility, it adds in social proof, it adds in trust, and it reduces the perceived risk of making this decision. So we want to use the third-party sources, the credibility, the social proof, the trust. We want to leverage that from as many sources as possible in our sales and marketing processes and techniques. And so there you have it. Those were my 3 biggest takeaways from this talk, but I am always curious. What were yours? Did anything challenge your perspective? Did anything jump out at you? If so, let's dive deeper into the conversation over on LinkedIn. I love to get into it there, and I share more insights and tend to spark conversations over on LinkedIn. I'm Mark Drager. You can find my contact details in the episode show notes. Now, while you're over on LinkedIn, be sure to follow Jonah Berger for more expert insights and actionable strategies. You can also check out his website, jonahberger.com. You can get a copy of his book. I highly recommend Contagious, as well as Invisible Influence, 2 of his books that I loved. The Catalyst, Magic Words, super, super relevant, super interesting. And one last thing, if you've made it this far into the show, you really should subscribe. And here's why. Every week, we share actionable strategies and tips, just like what Jonah shared with us today, to help supercharge your sales processes and boost sales. So with that, I'm Mark Drager. I will catch you in the next episode.